You may continue, Ms. Stringer. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honors, before the break, we described the incidents first at Plitvice in March of 1991, and then the incident in Borovo Selo in early May of 1991. I'd like now to move to August of 1991. The conflict continued to escalate during the summer months of 1991. During June, July, and August of that year, the JNA forces began sporadically shelling parts of Vukovar. The intensity grew as the summer went on. On the 1st of August, 1991, the town of Dal was taken by local Serbs and the JNA, which, on that day, crossed over from Serbia and deployed extensive heavy weaponry into the area. Some 50 JNA tanks were in the area of Erdut and Dal, shelling Erdut as they moved through the area. The evidence will show that a JNA tank fired on the police station at Dal, and the building was destroyed. A number of Croat policemen were killed there. This map shows the location of the town of Dal, a short distance north of Vukovar, just below Erdut on the Danube. And again, the arrow indicates Dal with Vukovar to the south and Erdut just to the north, all sitting along the banks of the Danube. The chamber will have evidence that Goran Hadžić was present with the JNA at the Dal police station on the 1st of August after the town had been taken. Once the Serb forces captured Dal, they had a foothold inside Croatia, from which they extended their military and political control throughout the territory declared by the SAO-SBWS. By late August of 1991, the JNA and other Serb forces had overrun the entire district of Baranja to the north of Dal, this area on the map that I'm indicating with the map. Even though the area overall had a relatively small Serb population of about 20 to 25%. During September and October of 1991, Serb forces, principally the JNA, took towns in western Srem to the south and east of Vukovar, such as Ilok, Sharongrad, Bapska, Lovas, and Tovarnik. And Your Honor, this map then shows the general area of those towns. With the mouse again, I'll just indicate Ilok on the far eastern edge of western Srem, Sharongrad, Lovas, the location of the minefield incident that was earlier described, Bapska, Tovarnik. As Your Honors can see from this map, taking control of western Srem secured the eastern edge of the SBWS along the Danube River and effectively eliminated the Croatian border that had separated the SBWS from its sponsor state, Serbia. The pattern in taking western Srem was to combine shelling attacks with ultimatums directed to local residents. To illustrate this, I'd like to describe what happened in the town of Bapska. By late September of 1991, as the JNA and other Serb forces took control over the western Srem area, the residents of Bapska were, like virtually all the other Croats in the area, either fleeing or negotiating terms with the Serb forces to allow them to remain. In Bapska, the negotiations were between the president of the local commune and a JNA commander. The JNA commander issued an ultimatum directing that Although the residents of Bapska had been peaceful so far, they must nonetheless, by 1600 hours on the 28th of September, 1991, surrender any weapons they had to the JNA. This next slide, Your Honors, is from Exhibit 65-0418. This is from the ultimatum that was issued on that day. And as Your Honors will see in Item 2, the JNA commander added this incentive to the residents of Bapska. If this is not done by this time, you can count on your village ceasing to exist on the geographical map. Many people of Bapska fled to nearby Ilok, where they met residents of the towns of Tovarnik, Lovas, and Sharongrad, who had also fled to Ilok because of the threats and the attacks of the Serb forces in their own towns. Ilok is the place I mentioned in my introductory comments. It's the place where the conditions were so bad that the people held a referendum on October 13th, 91, and decided to leave the town altogether. By emptying Ilok, the Serb forces had effectively emptied much of western Srem of its non-Serb inhabitants. They'd been systematically pushed eastward toward Ilok, the Danube River, and the Serbian border. And now they were gone. We're now in mid-October 1991, Your Honors. Before continuing, I'd like to focus for a moment on Goran Hadžić and the level of his own involvement and knowledge about all that's happened so far. In the first video clip that we saw of Mr. Hadžić, he was flying to New York in early 1993 for negotiations. This video is from Erdut. He's uniformed and appears to be carrying a sidearm. He describes military developments and events taking place throughout the SBWS. His references to the liberation of Western Srem, events in Ilok, and the ongoing battle for Vukovar tell us that this interview would have occurred around mid-October 1991.
Prelazimo na teren Slavonije I zapadnog Srema.
Reporter, we are moving to Slavonia and Western Srem. Dear viewers, following the press conference held in Erdut today, we asked Goran Hadžić, president of the Serb region of Slavonia, Baranja, and Western Srem, to answer some questions for viewers of the Belgrade television. Mr. Hadžić, to what extent is fierce fighting going on, if we can put it that way, in this theater of war? What are the prospects of this war? Goran Hadžić, fights are intense. This first action, first part, meaning liberation of Western Srem, is in its final stage. As I said, fights for Vukovar are ongoing. We can say that our units control nearly 50% of the city. We have secure positions and are advancing house by house. The action of mopping up Ustasha villages was also carried out in the last 2 days. Following mopping up of Šid Vinkovci section, a couple of Ustasha villages in this section of the central part of our region were mopped up 3 days ago. So Bogdanovci and the villages down there. Some villages surrender. In Ilok specifically, one wing offers to surrender, while the other extreme wing will not allow it. I will have talks regarding this issue today, so they can surrender their weapons and perpetrators can be held responsible before law and the innocent can stay and live with us. Reporter. Is Territorial Army, Defenders of the Villages, Yugoslav People's Army going to launch a stronger offensive since, as you yourself are aware, there is talk about a great number of complaints with regard to intense war activities, especially by the Yugoslav People's Army? Goran Hadžić. Well, there are complaints. These are, I could say, relatively justified given the attitude and possibilities. Our goal is not mass a mass killing of Croats, but punishing individuals in their midst. This means we have tried everything through democratic and other peaceful means to prevent this. However, even after our signing the truce agreements and negotiations, the Ustasha continue disregarding the signatures. It means that everyone with this, I do not trust them at all. This is clear to me. There can be no negotiations with them, and the situation has to be resolved militarily. The communique of the Supreme Command speaks to this effect, but we have to be aware that the army cannot carry this out without the people, so we will have to have some coordinated action, a real coordinated action between the people and the army.
So what does this tell us? This tells us that a uniformed president of the government, Goran Hadžić, was fully informed on the JNA's cleansing of towns in western Srem, such as Tovarnik, Bapska, Lovas. He also knew that closer to home, our units, as he calls them, were moving house to house in Vukovar and were mopping up Ustasha villages, as he describes them, in the region around Vukovar. As your honors will know, Ustasha is a term linked to what was called the independent state of Croatia from World War II. This was a fascist regime that exterminated large numbers of Serbs and Jews while allied with Nazi Germany. Referring to Croats as Ustashas was guaranteed to ratchet up fear and tension among Hadžić's listeners. The evidence will show that Goran Hadžić frequently used the term Ustasha as a way of referring to all Croats, as here in referring to Ustasha villages. This not only contributed to fear and division, but also served to demonize the Croat population itself, signaling that it was acceptable to target them. This video also tells us that Hadžić knew about the negotiations between Croats and the JNA that were taking place down in Ilok, saying that he would be directly involved in talks about that. Hadžić knew about complaints about the intense war activities, as they're described, of local Serbs, territorial defense, and the JNA. But Hadžić brushed off complaints as relatively justified. Hadžić believed that we have to have a coordinated action between the people and the army. Your honors, earlier I said the evidence would show that Goran Hadžić was a coordinator. He tells us that himself in this clip. His contribution was to ensure close coordination between, as he said, the people and the army. So far in these submissions, your honors, I've referred to several of the extermination and murder incidents that are charged in paragraphs 23 to 38 of the indictment, counts 2 through 4. Time does not permit me to go into great detail on each of the remaining incidents. However, I would like to briefly mention them now. Considered all together, these show the pattern and the widespread and systematic nature of the attack on non-Serbs that was happening all across the region. I've spoken already about the 21st of September 1991 incident when Goran Hadžić and Arkan came to the Dal police station. 11 non-Serb detainees were taken away and killed. Most of the bodies were later exhumed from Čelije. The incident is charged in paragraph 24 of the indictment. About 2 weeks later, on the night of the 4th of October, Arkan and his men, along with members of the local SBWS TO, returned to the police station, interrogated and murdered approximately 28 non-Serb detainees from Baranja, who'd been brought to the detention facility by the Serb Special Police a few days earlier. Archon and the other perpetrators then dumped the victims' bodies into the Danube River. When local residents of Del complained that their children could see the corpses floating down the river, Archon publicly admitted to participating in the killing and promised that next time he would bury the bodies of the victims instead. That incident's charged in indictment, paragraph 25. October 18th is the day of the Lovas minefield incident, which I described earlier in my submissions. That is charged in paragraph 26. And then on the 9th of November, 1991, we've described the arrest and the killing of the Pap, Kolosi, and Sanashi men, and also then the killings that followed of Juliana Pap, her son, and Natalia Rakin, after Juliana Pap went looking for her missing family members. Those incidents are charged in paragraphs 27 and 28 of the indictment. On the 11th of November, 1991, Archon's men came to the village of Klisa, east of Dal, and arrested non-Serb employees of the DP Dal company, which was an agricultural enterprise for the region. Those non-Serbs had gathered there at the farm to receive their paychecks. After enduring a night of brutal interrogations, Archon's men brought the detainees to the training center at the government compound in Erdut. 2 were released, but the other 5 were executed. One other employee of the DP Dal complained to Goran Hadžić about these arrests, and the accused responded that it was none of his business, and he refused to discuss the matter further. That's indictment, paragraph 29. Your Honors, you've heard me refer several times now to the Erdut Training Center and its proximity to the Hadžić government offices. This was without doubt the command center for the crimes committed against the local non-Serb population. On the 10th of December, 1991, in addition to the incidents I've already described, on the 10th of December, the local police and TO, along with Archon's men, arrested 5 non-Serbs from Erdut and took them to the training center and subsequently executed them. That's indictment, paragraph 34. The scenario was repeated with grim familiarity on the 26th of December with regard to 7 ethnic Hungarians and Croats. That's in page 35. Excuse me, indictment, paragraph 35. And then again on the 21st of February, 1992, 4 members of the Albert family, Juro, Helena, Victoria, and mother-in-law Ana Terzic, age 76. They were killed after being taken to the training center. That's charged in indictment, paragraph 36. On the 4th of May, 1992, in the small village of Grabovac, in the Baranja region of the SPWS, members of the Red Berets arrested 5 Croat and Hungarian civilians, including 2 women, Ruja Grofec and Anja Vlahovic, and killed them. Their bodies were found in the Tikvesh Park in Beli Manastir, near where the Red Berets were based. This is charged in indictment, paragraph 37. Finally, Your Honors, you'll recall that at the beginning of my presentation, I described the 9th of November 1991 incident in which a number of men of the Pap, Kolosi, and Sanashi families were killed. On the 3rd of June 1992, Maria Sanashi, the wife, mother, or mother-in-law of 3 of those men who had been killed earlier in November 91, she was executed by members of Goran Hadžić's security unit, the SNB, who were working with Archon's men. Her offense was the same as Juliana Pop's. She'd asked too many questions about the fate of her missing family members. Altogether, the incidents of murder and extermination, as charged in the indictment, span September of 1991 to June of 1992. The indictment lists 348 victims of murder and extermination during that period. But there are still some murder and extermination incidents charged in the indictment that I've not yet mentioned, and those are linked to Vukovar. During 1991, Croatian armed forces, such as the Croatian National Guard, had blockaded JNA barracks in different parts of Croatia, including the JNA barracks in Vukovar. After an earlier attempt to lift the blockade had failed, the JNA succeeded in deblocking its Vukovar barracks in early October 1991. After the Vukovar JNA barracks was deblocked, the JNA demanded that the Croatian fighters in Vukovar lay down their arms. The Croats refused to surrender. This then gave rise to one of the most brutal and destructive battles that occurred in the wars of the former Yugoslavia, the Battle for Vukovar. After the Croats refused to surrender, the JNA laid siege to the town, cutting off water and power while pounding the city with artillery and even aerial bombing. The population of Vukovar went underground, holing up in basements during what would be a 7-week siege. As Hadžić himself indicated in the video clip played earlier, the battle for Vukovar was fought street by street, house by house. When it was over, the town and its structures were completely destroyed. Before it all started, the municipality of Vukovar was populated by some 84,000 people, 43% Croats, 38% Serbs, with the remainder declaring themselves to be Hungarians, Muslims, and other groups or nationalities. Despite the fact that Croats were the largest ethnic group, Vukovar was nonetheless slated to be the capital of the SAO SBWS. Vukovar was to be taken so it could be a Serb town. The 18th of November 1991 marks the fall of the city of Vukovar with the surrender of the last pockets of Croatian resistance. The siege and battle for Vukovar, its fall to Serb forces on the 18th, and the terror and the violence that reigned in the days that followed have all been closely examined in previous cases in this tribunal, going all the way back to the trial of Slavko Dokmanović that ended in June of 1998. When Vukovar fell, he was the Minister of Agriculture in Hadžić's SBWS government. Dokmanović committed suicide here shortly before his judgment was announced. Your Honors, I'd like to run a short video clip now that gives the Chamber an idea, an impression of what the town of Vukovar looked like after the battle was over. This footage is from late 1991, after Vukovar fell, so this would be within a month or so after the fall of the town. Okay, Colin. You can pull that down. In the final days before Vukovar fell, hundreds of civilians and Croatian combatants who had laid down their arms sought refuge at the Vukovar hospital as rumors circulated that an evacuation supervised by the international community would take place from the hospital. The JNA took control of the hospital on the 19th, despite an agreement reached between the JNA and the Croatian government, which placed the hospital under the protection of the ICRC and for the duration of the evacuation. The JNA and the Croatian government also agreed that the ECMM would monitor the entire operation, the ECMM being the European Community Monitoring Mission. This is a photograph of the Vukovar hospital from this period. The evacuation or removal of the Croat population from Vukovar was to take place on November 20th. That morning, the JNA ordered men and women out of the hospital. Men were separated from women and children. The scene in Vukovar was chaos as the Serb forces, including volunteers and Chetniks, some of them drunk, moved through the town, rounding up the non-Serb population as they emerged from their cellars. These are photos of the women and children from the day. After the Croat men were separated from the women and children, about 200 of them, men, were loaded onto 5 buses lined up outside the hospital. Representatives of the ICRC and the ECMM were in Vukovar trying desperately to get to the hospital so they could monitor the treatment of the Croats being removed. However, they were prevented by the JNA from reaching the hospital before the 5 busloads of prisoners had left. The buses drove to the JNA barracks in Vukovar and remained parked there for several hours, with the detained men on board. Serb TO members and paramilitaries milled around the buses and started to threaten and verbally abuse the men on the buses. A 6th bus arrived shortly thereafter. Beatings began. While the buses were being held at the JNA barracks, a meeting was held at another place called Velepromet, outside of Vukovar, between members of the SAO SBWS government and members of the JNA. We see the location of the hospital, the JNA barracks, and the Velepromet facility on this slide. This meeting at Velepromet was to decide the fate of the 200 men being held at the JNA barracks. Goran Hadžić, as president of the government of the SAO, SBWS, attended the meeting. He came to the meeting with Archon. Hadžić and other government members insisted that the Croat prisoners must remain in Vukovar, claiming that they would be prosecuted before local courts. Shortly after Vukovar fell, a first group of about 200 prisoners had already been transported down to the prison at Sremska Mitrovica in Serbia. The evidence will show that Goran Hadžić was firmly opposed to any more prisoners leaving the SBWS. Your Honor, this slide relates to the incident, one of the additional murder and extermination incidents here charged in paragraph 31. The Velepromet facility, where the meeting was held on the 20th of November, was itself a detention facility where hundreds of Croats were being detained and beaten on the 19th, 20th, and 21st of November 1991. Paragraph 31 of the indictment refers to the 17 prisoners who were killed there. Some prisoners refer to the room of death at Velepromet, a room where prisoners were kept before they were killed. Many of the prisoners at Velepromet were later transferred to the Sremska Mitrovica prison in Serbia, and I will speak about that shortly. Your Honors, this clip is also from the 20th of November, 1991. Here we see Hadžić, Arkan, and other members of Hadžić's government and the JNA at the Velepromet facility. The parties have agreed that Arkan had accompanied Hadžić to the Velepromet meeting. In this footage, we see Hadžić giving an interview, and in close proximity, we see Arkan along with others. I should say that we don't need translation or interpretation for this. It's just the images we'd like to see. Here, Your Honor, this is, Your Honors will see, this is Željko Ražnatović, Arkan, and Your Honors will also be able to identify Mr. Hadžić in the background. The next video clip is from an interview that Goran Hadžić gave later, shortly after the Velepromet meeting.
This is the first session of the government, held in the future capital of our Serb district of Slavonia, Baranja, and Western Srem. As for the conclusions, apart from the ones relating to normalization of life and creation of a more or less normal situation, the main conclusion is that the prisoners, the Ustašas with blood on their hands, must not leave the territory of the Serbian district of Slavonia, Baranja, and Western Srem, and cannot go to Serbia, cannot be taken there, because Serbia is not a country at war. Also, the troops that helped capture them, the captured persons are not soldiers. They are members of paramilitary formations. They can only be put on trial by the people here, that is to say, the people of our Serbian district, which has been recognized, has its court, even a court of second instance. The third instance might possibly be at the federal level, at Yugoslav level. And we have our district court and our municipal court. Consequently, we have agreed with the military authorities that these Ustaša remain in some of our camps here in the vicinity of Vukovar. Since one group was already taken to Sremska Mitrovica, I undertook the task of bringing these people back. If we can call them people, we shall bring them back, put them on trial, those who are guilty. Those who are not guilty will, of course, be released so they can join us in the reconstruction of our town.
Your Honors, in this video clip, Goran Hadžić himself tells us the central role that he played in keeping those prisoners in the SBWS and preventing their removal to Serbia. As he says, we have agreed with the military authorities that those Ustaša remain in some of our camps here in the vicinity of Vukovar. Since one group was already taken to Sremska Mitrovica, he says, I undertook the task to return those people, if they can be called people, and to put them on trial. With these words, Hadžić tells us that he has taken responsibility for these prisoners. He and his civilian authorities have assumed custody of them from the military authorities. The fact that Hadžić questions whether they can be called people signals the quality of justice that they can expect to receive in the SBWS. Your Honors, the evidence will show that once Hadžić succeeded in persuading the JNA to turn those 200 men over to him and his people, despite his promises of trials and justice, their fate was never in doubt. We've already heard what Archon's policy was in respect of prisoners. The buses with the 200 or so Vukovar prisoners left the JNA barracks between 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 20th of November and were escorted by military police of the JNA Operative Group South, headed to the farming village of Ovčara, located 5 or 6 kilometers from Vukovar. The buses arrived at a large hangar facility used to store farm equipment. The detained men were ordered into the hangar. While making their way in from the buses, they had to pass through a gauntlet composed of TO soldiers and members of paramilitary formations who kicked and punched the Croat prisoners as they passed through. A local farmer was ordered to take his front end loader and dig a pit in a field that was less than 2 kilometers away from the hangar. Severe beatings continued inside the hangar facility for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening of the 20th. At least 2 prisoners died there. In the evening, they started transporting the prisoners in groups of 10 and 20 in a small truck out to the site where the pit had been dug. The killings took place over several hours, extending beyond midnight into the early morning hours of November 21st, 1991. The men were lined up at the pit and executed. Altogether, 260 were killed or executed. The remains of 194 victims were recovered from the mass grave in 1996. That incident's charged in paragraph 32 of the indictment. Other Vukovar prisoners were transported towards Dal on the 19th, 20th, and 21st of November. When they reached Borovo Selo, 2 buses were stopped by members of the local TO and redirected to an enterprise called Lovas Farms, which actually is located near Dal, not Lovas. Several of the detainees were killed at this Lovas Farms facility. Other Vukovar prisoners were taken to Dal and held in hangars belonging to the DPK Dal Company, where they were mistreated and beaten. Some of them were killed. In total, at least 35 of these detainees were executed and dumped into mass graves at Lovas Farms and Dal. This is charged in paragraph 33 of the indictment. Your Honors, I would now like to address the detention facilities and describe some of the detention crimes that are charged in counts 5 through 9 of the indictment. These counts, Your Honors, charge Hadžić with crimes based on the mistreatment of non-Serbs who were arrested in the SBWS and detained in various detention facilities located not only in the SBWS, but in Serbia also. The detention sites are listed in paragraph 41 of the indictment. The evidence will be that the prisoners were held and mistreated not only at detention facilities set up close to their own homes or places where they were arrested. For example, the training center in Erdut or the Zadruga building in Lovas that I've already mentioned, but also these facilities in Serbia. A number of these sites were the last known locations of the victims of murder and extermination that we've already mentioned. This first series of slides will indicate the locations of the detention facilities in the territory of the SBWS. There were police buildings and a hangar in Dal, the Erdut Training Center that I've mentioned now repeatedly, and then some sites, detention sites located to, or linked to the fall of Vukovar, the hospital, JNA barracks, the Ovčara farm, where the beatings occurred in the hangar before the prisoners were executed, and also the Velepromet facility, where the meeting was held on the 20th of November, 1991, and where prisoners were beaten and killed as well. There was a detention site in the town of Opatovac, and also in Borovo Selo, a workshop or a stable that was used. And finally, as I've mentioned, the Zadruga building in Lovas. Beatings and mistreatment occurred in all of these places. We now move to the detention facilities that were located in Serbia. These are the Stojačevo farm, the agricultural complex in Begići, the military barracks in Zrenjanin, the military prison at Sremska Mitrovica that Hadžić refers to in the video clip we just saw. He went to this prison. And also the military prison at Šid, across the river in Serbia. Some of these prisons had hundreds of detainees. Others had smaller numbers. The non-Serb detainees in all of these facilities arrived in different ways. As we've heard, several of these places are associated with the fall of Vukovar. One other place that the Chamber will hear evidence about is the Borovo Commerce Shelter, where around 1,500 Vukovar residents, including women and children, were taken prisoner. After the shelter was set on fire, many of these detainees, including the women and children, were transferred to the Borovo Primary School, where they were interrogated and mistreated before being expelled from the SBWS. The Chamber will hear evidence that Goran Hadžić, dressed in a military uniform, came to the Borovo Primary School looking for a particular prisoner. Others were arrested and held in these places for interrogations, often before being killed. Many of the prisoners were people arrested and imprisoned by the Serb forces as they took control of their towns and villages across the SBWS during the late summer and autumn of 1991. People who couldn't flee or who simply had nowhere else to go were eventually rounded up and shipped off to these places. The prisoners were not just men of military age. Civilians, elderly, and women were victims of murders, as we've seen. They were also victims of this unlawful imprisonment and mistreatment. Many of them were moved around between multiple centers over the course of days, weeks, and months. From day to day, they didn't know they did not know when and where they would be taken or what would await them when they arrived. Simply being moved from one detention center to another posed a risk of death or injury. Prisoners were beaten during transfers by guards and were even tormented by locals on the road who'd been told on the radio that the Ustashas would be passing through. They rocked the buses and threw stones at the terrified prisoners. To be transferred to a new detention facility meant being subjected to new beatings and other forms of mistreatment. In these prisons, the detainees suffered every form of mistreatment and abuse. Prisoners were tortured by JNA officers and military police. Women suffered sexual violence. Prisoners were forced to beat other prisoners. Some were tormented by mock executions or forced to dig large holes which, they were told, would be their own graves. When prisoners died from their injuries, nothing was done. Apart from the beatings and mistreatment, the conditions in these places were horrible. There was overcrowding and outbreaks of lice. Prisoners were only permitted to shower right before the arrival of TV crews or the ICRC. They suffered from malnutrition and inadequate medical care. Doctors who were held prisoner themselves made requests for medical supplies, but these were ignored as the conditions of the prisoners deteriorated further. Goran Hadžić went to Sremska Mitrovica prison, and he would have seen the conditions there. The survivors of these detention crimes, those who lived to be exchanged or released, still suffer permanent impairment due to the physical and psychological trauma they endured. Many were held for months, only to be released in such poor condition that they spent years trying to recover from their injuries. Your Honors will hear the evidence of men and women who still live with debilitating conditions and serious disabilities resulting from their imprisonment in these facilities. Your Honor, I would now like to briefly address counts 12 to 14, which charge Goran Hadžić with individual criminal responsibility for the crimes of destruction and plunder, including the destruction of religious sites. As the Serb forces took control of the villages and towns across the SBWS, killing or driving out the non-Serb inhabitants, what they didn't destroy, they took for themselves. In this, the JNA and its commanders coordinated closely with other units, including Archon's men. They were also reinforced by two other groups notorious for looting property from non-Serb homes. These were the JNA reservists and the Serbian volunteers dispatched by Šešel's Serbian Radical Party. After their owners were killed, the Erdut homes of the Kolosi and the Albert families, the trial chamber has already heard those names, as well as the homes of others killed by Serb forces. These homes were all taken over by Serbs. The chamber will hear that after Archon's men killed one man, a lorry arrived at the man's house to remove his possessions. In Erdut, a group that called itself the Refugees Protection Committee of the TO staff gave Serb refugees the homes of Croats and non-Serbs. This committee exercised its authority over the remaining non-Serbs by issuing orders to vacate property immediately. Some victims' homes were occupied by Archon's men. In the towns of western Srem, such as Sharongrad, Lovas, Tovarnik, and Bapska, the JNA drove the local populations out with heavy artillery, tank, and mortar fire. After the towns were destroyed and the people fled, many of them to Ilok, the Serb forces systematically plundered their homes. The evidence will show that Serb forces, and Archon in particular, targeted, damaged, and destroyed religious and cultural structures such as Catholic churches and mosques in various locations during this period, as well as in 1992 and 1993. Your Honors, at this point, I would like to move on to 1992. where significant developments occurred with the acceptance and implementation of the Vance Plan, also the establishment of the RSK, and Goran Hadžić's election as its president. As the violence and crime escalated inside the SBWS during the months I've just described, August through November 1991, the international community became increasingly involved in efforts to stop the violence, broker a ceasefire, and protect civilian populations that were being terrorized and uprooted from their towns and villages throughout Croatia. Your honors have already seen this map. The conflicts between Croats and Serbs weren't just taking place in the SAO, SBWS in late 1991, but also in the SAOs of Krajina and Western Slavonia. Croats and non-Serbs were not the only victims. Large numbers of ethnic Serbs were driven out of their homes and villages in areas under Croat control. This was especially true in the SAO Western Slavonia, where the areas under Serb control fell far short of the borders declared for the SAO Western Slavonia. By late 1991, war and ethnic cleansing had driven thousands, Croats and Serbs alike, from their homes. In Geneva on the 23rd of November 1991, 5 days after the fall of Vukovar, UN Special Envoy Cyrus Vance obtained signatures of Serbian President Milosevic, Croatian President Tudjman, and General Kadijevic on a ceasefire agreement that eventually served as the basis for what became known as the Vance Plan. I'd like to provide a brief overview of the Vance Plan because it is tied to several important developments that impact this case throughout 1992 and 1993. Apart from the ceasefire, these were the main aspects of the plan. UN protected areas, or UNPAs, were to be established in Croatia. The territory of the 4 UNPAs would correspond generally to the territory of the 3 SAOs. As your honors can see, UNPA Sector East on this map corresponds quite closely to what we now know is the territory of the SAO SBWS. Under the Vance Plan, UNPA Sector North and Sector South corresponded roughly, quite closely, but not precisely, to the territory of what had been the SAO Krajina. And then thirdly, UNPA Sector West corresponded to the territory of the SAO Western Slavonia, again, although it extended beyond territory controlled by the Serbs there. Under the Vance Plan, these UNPAs were to be demilitarized, and people living within those UNPAs were to be protected by a United Nations protection force called UNPROFOR, consisting of military personnel and civilian police. The protection force became known colloquially as the Blue Helmets. The JNA and other military personnel from Serbia were to withdraw under the Vance Plan, and the local police would be responsible for maintaining law and order. Importantly, displaced persons, that is, people who'd been expelled from their homes or who'd fled, would be allowed to return. In late 1991, among the Serb leadership, Slobodan Milosevic supported the plan. After initially opposing it, Goran Hadžić joined Milosevic in supporting the plan for the SAO-SBWS, although, as we will see, he did not accept the provisions allowing non-Serbs to return or on demilitarization. Milan Babić, the leader of the SAO Krajina, remained strongly opposed to the plan. The evidence will show that his refusal to support the Vance plan cost Babić the support of Milosevic and Belgrade. The evidence will show that this led to Hadžić's elevation to the position of president of the RSK in late February 1992. And I'll speak about that in a few minutes. Another reason why the Vance plan is significant for this case is because by the spring of 1992, the first UNPROFOR personnel began arriving in the UNPAs, that is, within the territory of the SAOs in Croatia. This meant that for the first time since the conflict began, internationals would be present in the very areas where the crimes that I've been discussing this morning were taking place. In carrying out their mandate, the UNPROFOR personnel began seeing things, hearing things, meeting with local authorities, and most importantly, writing reports. During the trial, the Chamber will hear the evidence of international staff who will have the benefit of the reports written by them and their colleagues. The Chamber will have evidence that the persecution and expulsion of non-Serbs from the Serb-held territories in Croatia continued throughout 1992 and 1993. There's one last series of important political developments that I'd like to mention. In late 1991, Babić and the leadership of the SAO Krajina formally declared that SAO to be a republic, called the Republic of Srpska Krajina, RSK. On the 26th of February, 1992, as preparations were underway for the UN Protection Force to begin deploying into the UNPAs under the Vance Plan, Croatian Serb leaders of the SAO-SBWS and Western Slavonia met at Borovo Selo, where they decided to join the RSK. At this time, amendments to the RSK Constitution were adopted, a government was formed, and Goran Hadžić was elected president of the Republic of Serbian Krajina. As president now of the Republic, by the 26th of February 1992, these were some of Hadžić's powers and responsibilities under the RSK Constitution. He could proclaim laws by edict. He performed duties in the domain of foreign affairs between RSK and other states and international institutions. And he commanded the armed forces in peace and during a state of war, and also commanded the national resistance during a state of war. He could issue orders for general and partial mobilization. And so, beginning in February of 1992, there's a significant change in the nature of the conflict between Croats and Serbs. The size of the territory over which Hadžić has authority, and the nature of his powers. The nature of the conflict changed because, with the establishment of the UNPAs and the arrival of the Blue Helmets, the confrontation lines remained fairly stable, although there was continued armed conflict between Serb and Croatian forces throughout the remaining time frame for our case, 1992 and 1993. the size of the territory over which Hadžić had authority increased substantially because, as president of the RSK, his authority now extended throughout the combined territories of what had been SAO Krajina, SAO Western Slavonia, and SAO SBWS. Hadžić enjoyed an expansion of his de jure powers under the RSK Constitution. One thing, however, did not change. The evidence will show that Hadžić's policy on populations within the RSK was no different than his policy in the SAO SBWS. He rejected coexistence with Croats and non-Serbs in the areas under Serb control. He embraced the Vance Plan only as a way to preserve the status quo of Serb-held territory in Croatia. Throughout 1992 and 1993, non-Serbs continued to be persecuted and expelled from the RSK. Despite his public support for the Vance Plan, Hadžić did not support the return of non-Serb refugees into areas under Serb control. RSK policy was to prevent their return. I'd like to briefly address Hadžić's role as president of the RSK during this period. As we've seen, under the RSK Constitution, Hadžić was essentially commander-in-chief of the armed forces. But under the Vance Plan, the RSK wasn't supposed to have military forces, just police forces. With the proclamation of the RSK, territorial defense forces were formed, and under the RSK Constitution, they were subordinated to Hadžić. In contravention of the Vance Plan, the Serbian military and police organs that were supposed to withdraw under the Vance Plan instead turned over their military equipment to the newly formed RSK-TO units, and even some JNA personnel remained and served in the RSK territorial defense. These RSK police continued to be financed, trained, and equipped by Serbia, including the Serbian Ministry of Interior. When UNPROFOR was deployed to Croatia in May of 1992, many of the RSK-TO units were then transformed into these special police units, since under the Vance Plan, the police were the only authorities authorized to be present in the UNPAs. Instead of withdrawing or demobilizing, JNA and RSK territorial defense, commanding officers, personnel, and equipment were transformed to these newly formed special police units. Even JNA and TO vehicles were repainted to make them into police vehicles. Also in violation of the Vance Plan, on the 18th of May 1992, Hadžić, as president, promulgated a decision establishing the Serbian Army of the RSK, called the SVK. Not surprisingly, the SVK relied heavily on financial, logistical, and operational support from the Yugoslav Army and Serbia's political leadership. Also contrary to the Vance Plan undertaking on demilitarization, Archon's Tigers arrived in Knin from the SBWS and fought there in early 1993. They were an integral part of the SVK. Goran Hadžić's role during this period as commander-in-chief of the SVK is illustrated here in the military rally held in July of 1992. The occasion is Hadžić's promotion of Milan Martić and Colonel Borislav Đukić to the rank of general of the SVK.
Goran Hadžić. May God be with you. The public, may God be with you. Goran Hadžić. I greet you all in the name of all citizens of the Republic of Serbian Krajina, and please allow me to thank you for all you have done for us all. You, standing here before us, you are the new Obilićes and Sinđelićes, the new heroes whose actions will be written about in the history books of the Serbian people. Your brothers and ours who gave their lives will go down in history as saints, and their blood spilled for the freedom of the Serbian people is holy. Through this act which you have carried out, we have shown that the Serbian people have never been on their knees and have never asked anybody for mercy, that we can accomplish all we want by ourselves. And from this place here, we send a joint message to all the wheelers and dealers of the world that the Republic of Serbian Krajina is not for sale. No price can be put on our freedom, and we will not sell it for any money in the world. We are now in a very difficult situation, encircled on all sides by our enemies, but we have never yet been so unified and decisive to defend our freedom. Most importantly, we are aware of our enemies, and nobody can fool the Serbian people anymore with some new brotherhood and unity, some new deceits. All citizens of the Republic of Serbian Krajina are equal and will be equal regardless of their ethnicity, but it must be known that this is the Republic of Serbian Krajina, and those who accept that can live here. Those who do not want to can leave the Republic of Serbian Krajina. Now, I don't want to tire our brave troops in this sun anymore. I would like to thank them once again and to publicly announce here for the first time that as of today we have two new generals of the Serbian army. They are Borislav Đukić and Milan Martić. Long live and thank you.
Your Honors, the evidence will show that during 1992 and 1993, Martić and Đukić were among the RSK authorities, both civilian and military, led by the accused, who implemented persecutory policies to remove the remaining non-Serbs from the Serb-held territories, while at the same time preventing those already expelled from returning. While thousands of non-Serb residents had been killed or fled during 1991, those who remained were targeted. The non-Serbs living in the RSK suffered abuses ranging from losing their jobs and freedom of movement to losing their homes and even their lives. One UN official said that they were subjected to a, quote, prolonged and consistent pattern of intimidation, close quote. Discrimination against the non-Serbs of the RSK was part of the wider program of ethnic cleansing, one purpose of which was to free up houses for Serbs being welcomed from other areas. Those who remained were extremely vulnerable and were preyed upon by the Serb forces as they were repeatedly robbed and their property taken. You will hear testimony that the RSK leadership ensured that even when non-Serb farmers were owed money for their crops, the local cooperative was ordered not to give them the food coupons they'd earned. The effect was that they couldn't feed their families. You will hear evidence from an UNPROFOR official in Beli Manastir, located in the Baranja region of SBWS, that non-Serbs slept outside the headquarters of the Belgian UNPROFOR peacekeepers there because they were afraid of the violence they would face by Serb forces if they returned to their homes. The ranking UNPROFOR official in Sector East, the SBWS region, will describe the expulsions of non-Serbs he witnessed from the towns of Erdut and Alimas on the 11th of April, 1992. Elderly people, women, and children were forcibly removed from their homes and forced to leave their possessions behind, loaded onto buses bound for Croat-held territory at gunpoint. When confronted about these crimes, the RSK authorities made half-hearted attempts to characterize the departure as voluntary. Another UNPROFOR official raised the issue of expulsions directly with Hadžić in April 1992. Hadžić's response was to demand that the accusers be brought directly to him, or to refer to centuries of oppression suffered by Serbs, as though that was a form of justification for what was taking place. The Chamber will hear the evidence of several UN officials about the destruction and plunder of non-Serb property that continued during 1992 and 1993. Churches and mosques were also targeted. The JNA and Serb forces targeted and caused extensive damage to the churches in Sharongrad, Erdut, Dal, Tovarnik, Bapska, and Alimas. The destruction of places of worship continued even after UNPROFOR's deployment. In the fall of 1992, UNPROFOR received reports on the destruction of churches near Kanin and other parts of that area. In 1993, another UNPROFOR official noticed an increase in attacks on churches in Sector East, culminating in April of that year. This official complained bitterly to the RSK authorities in April 1993 when rockets were fired at the church in Elok and a bomb was detonated on the steps of the Elok Monastery. The destruction of these religious buildings served no military purpose. Rather, Serb forces intentionally destroyed them in order to show the non-Serbs that as a people, a community, they no longer had a place in this Republic of Serbian Krajina. Their places of worship, symbolic of one of their defining characteristics as a group, ceased to exist. And so, what was the end result of all of this crime, murder, and expulsion that occurred in the areas of the SBWS and the RSK under Goran Hadžić? The demographic evidence to be presented at the trial will show that the territories of the SBWS and Krajina were overall ethnically mixed in March of 1991, with a similar proportion of Serbs and Croats overall, with some ethnic minorities as well. Your honors have heard about Hungarians, and also Slovaks. However, some of the areas, such as Western Srem and Baranja, had a relatively small number of Serbs. The city of Vukovar was roughly 43% Croat, 38% Serb before the conflict. To transform these regions into essentially ethnic Serb territories would require huge numbers of people to be moved out, expelled. The evidence is going to show that that is exactly what happened during Goran Hadžić's tenure, first as Prime Minister of the SBWS and then as President of the RSK. The evidence will show that hundreds of thousands, at least 180,000 people, were forcibly expelled from these territories between the 25th of June, 1991, when Hadžić was designated to be the leader of the SBWS government, and 31 December 1993, which is the end of Hadžić's tenure as president of the RSK. Over 90%, 97% of these people were ethnic Croats and non-Serbs. In Vukovar alone, roughly 20,000 people were expelled after the city fell to Serb forces. 97.9% of them were non-Serbs. Vukovar was to be the capital of the SBWS. On the 2nd of March 1992, shortly after he became president of the RSK, Goran Hadžić attended a meeting of the SFRY presidency held in Belgrade. He was accompanied by a man named Zdravko Zečević, who was the RSK prime minister, the leader of the RSK government. Also present at this meeting were Milan Martić and Mr. Paspal, who had traveled with Mr. Hadžić to New York in early 1993 in the video footage that we saw earlier.
Mr. Stringer, it's about that time.
I can finish in about 5 minutes, Your Honor, if we could. If I can come back and conclude, but I've literally got about 1 page
Okay.
left.
Please go ahead.
I apologize. I thought we were going to go another hour and a half. I'd forgotten about the 1:15. The meeting on March 2nd, 1992, at the presidency in Belgrade was attended, as I've said, by Hadžić, Martić, Paspal, and the RSK Prime Minister Zečević. This is what Zečević said about the idea that Croats, driven from the town of Benkovac, might actually return, as was envisioned under the Vance Plan. And I apologize for the long quote, Your Honors, but I would like to read it. Mr. Zečević said, "It's not my intention to bother you with a specific situation in Benkovac, but this town is specific when it comes to refugees. We are thinking only about our refugees, and we would like them to come back, and they are welcome here. I'm in panic when I think that 15,000 Croats would return to Benkovac, and they are mostly peasants, emotionally linked to the soil. They are now compacted in Zadar area, along the coastal area. I fear the excess ignited by our people. This issue is a complex one. The instinct made our people burn anything that belonged to Croats in order to prevent them from coming back to their homes. The truth is that we cannot live together, that we do not want to live with them anymore. But there is also another type of truth, which is recognized by a democratic world, and which claims that these people have the right to return to their homes. I really cannot imagine how we are going to organize life then. I guess we will have to think about it later. I'm picturing it like this. Well, gentlemen, the schools will teach Cyrillic, and you will hate it so much that you will simply have to leave. That is what is awaiting us. Your Honors, the evidence will show that Mr. Zečević's candid words about the prospects for those peasants emotionally tied to the soil actually being allowed to come back to their homes and work their land. Statements made while his president, Goran Hadžić, sat silently nearby, are in fact an accurate statement of the RSK government policy under Hadžić. In Hadžić's RSK, only Serbs were welcome. At the end of 1993, Goran Hadžić lost a general election to Milan Martić, who then took over to become the president of the RSK. In 1995, the RSK and the territories in Croatia, claimed as Serb autonomous territory, all disappeared. Croatia retook the areas of the SAO, Western Slavonia, and Krajina in military operations called Flash and Storm. The territory of what had been the SAO SBWS was gradually reintegrated into Croatia after the signing of the Erdut Agreement in late 1995. Even if Goran Hadžić had not succeeded in creating a permanent Serbian entity or state in Croatia, the evidence will show that he did, at least during the time that he was in power, succeed with his JCE members in separating Serbs from non-Serbs there. This was achieved by the commission of many crimes, the crimes charged in the indictment in this case. We thank your honors for your attention. At the end of this trial, the prosecution will return to ask that the chamber find Goran Hadžić guilty of the crimes he's charged with in this case, as set out in counts 1 through 14 of the indictment.
Thank you, Mrs. Stringer. We will now break and come back at 12:50.
All rise, vive levé.